first I'd like to thank Etienne for a very good introduction to our day. I enjoyed it a lot, and I know it's generated a lot of conversation. It's my pleasure to introduce to you now Deb Wallace. She's the Managing Director of the Baker Library Services at the Harvard School of Business. Deb is very known to our community here, certainly in Waterloo. Worked at Clerica for a number of years. And has more recently moved back to the United States to the Harvard Business School. She's co-authored a book on leveraging communities of practice for strategic advantage. So she'll be talking about taking communities of practice into active, real applications. So I'll let Deb go on now because I'd like to hear her presentation. So please welcome Deb Wallace.
Thanks. Thanks. There's a number of slides in your handout, and I'm not going to go through them sequentially. I'll try following on some of the things that Etienne was talking about. What my job is, if you look up the word Deborah, it means the bee. And I'm busy, and I do things. So I work with people like Etienne who come up with these great ideas and identify all these wonderful concepts. And then they turn it over to me and they say, who is the guy from Star Trek? Make it so? So that's my job, is to make it so. And what I'd like to do today is to talk to you a bit about some of my experiences making it so. I have a very checkered past. I was telling Shirley this morning that my first job was teaching grammar to prepubescent alpha males. And that was probably got me all ready to work with you guys. But it taught me that you really have to go with the flow. And as a teacher, you have to grab onto those aha moments and run with them. And so you may not always hit the curriculum, but you've got to take those ideas and build on it, because that's where the importance is. And I've learned that a lot in facilitating communities, is that you may come in with a structured idea and a plan, and by the end of the day, you're nowhere near where you thought you would be, but more importantly, you're where your people you're working with want to be. So, as I said, I have some things to share with you, but by all means, take me where you want to go today. That's why I'm here, okay? I'd like to start out with this Dilbert comic, because I think this says a lot about communities, is that when Sir Francis Bacon said knowledge is power, he was actually talking about devolving power and getting knowledge out to the individuals. It wasn't about hoarding. It was about public education and the importance of us all building our own personal knowledge bases. So we've taken that and we've kind of turned it out of context and said, I'm going to hold this all to my chest because that makes me more powerful. When in fact, when we push it out, we're all more powerful. So I think that's really the message of communities, is how do we share our knowledge to empower all of us. Anyway, some of the things to think about, and again, this is going to be a bit random because I'd like to pull on some of the things that Etienne was talking about instead of just following a script, is that what is key to the success of any community is a shared sense of purpose. And that, the slide follows in your handout, is that people come to community for different things. And if you study community, as Etienne has done, probably see some of the most successful communities have come together around disaster, right? Because they pull together people in a common purpose. I was talking about communities of practice to a group of corporate librarians in New York City shortly after 9/11 and shortly after the ice storm that we had in Ontario and Quebec. Remember that storm where all the trees? And of course I was talking about, can you imagine a natural disaster like an ice storm? And I'm thinking, you know, it totally missed. They had 9/11, slightly different level of disaster. But the way these communities came together, they brought, something was the rallying point. And they brought all these different perspectives to the table to try to solve that problem. So when you think about communities, think about it as an opportunity to design once you know what the problem is, once you can kind of articulate and get your stake in the sand of what is the problem, I think you're already there. The problem is we need to commercialize our IP and make a difference to the lives of Ontarians. So you've already got a rallying cry. So how are you going to go about making this thing real? And the notion of cross-gender and or cross-generations is a really interesting one, because in a number of the communities that I've worked in, it's actually the younger people who teach the older people much more about community than vice versa, but that's another story. At any rate, what we've seen is that people come together for a variety of reasons. You'll have lots of different agendas on the table, but by recognizing that, you're actually a lot further along than trying to push that down. So people come to a community for a purpose. As we were saying earlier, we're all very busy people. If you think about your schedule in the last X number of days, how long have you sat in one seat for more than about 10 minutes? You're twitching already. I can see it. I've been watching it. And it's not that we aren't enthrallingly engaging, are we? You're not used to doing this, so we're taking you out of your comfort level. At any rate, people come to community these are some of the reasons that we've seen, is they really need to know something. We've seen that communities are problem-solving think tanks. You can put a problem on the table, work through something that is called productive inquiry. I put a problem on the table, you then look at that and say, in my experience, from my realm of knowledge, from things that I've understood and learned from other people, I can offer you this solution. And then Dominic might take that and say, yeah, that's all very well and good, Deb, but when I looked at that, when that happened to me, this is what happened. And I'll go through that story and relate what happened. And then you'll keep building an answer based on what people know and can contribute. So you come to community because you need to know something. You also come to community because you want to contribute. I really do believe that we as human beings want to contribute. We don't want to hoard this to our chest. We want to get it out there. And what we saw at Clerica with our agent network, we had very senior sponsorship. The Executive Vice President for Strategic Capabilities, senior member of the management team, in conjunction with the head of the sales force. So we had two very senior leaders. And we had people who wanted to come to the community because they were nearing retirement. And they were wanting to give back to the company, to the profession, to their colleagues. And so they really wanted to contribute. And they gave more than they took away from a point of view of a knowledge exchange. But they probably took more away in a satisfaction of passing their knowledge on to others. So you have a need to contribute. We also have a real need to make a difference. And I think this goes back to what Etienne was talking about, is in the domain. We want to continue to build the domain. We want to be able to make a difference. I would think that the government's mandate here of how do we operationalize or commercialize all the IP that we have funded over time is a huge challenge to you as a community to make a difference. You need to take some action. You need to get something done. Some groups I've worked with, I've said the really great thing about communities, especially within an organization, is they don't do any work. People go, whoa, I'll sign up for that. If there's no work involved, let me have that. But the bottom line is that they don't have an agenda that may be a project or specific goals. They do take a lot of action, but they may not accomplish specific work in the same way we think about a team or a unit or any other kind of organizational structure that has some strategy. And we need to belong. Whether we're the hermit living out in, we belong to society in a different way. But the community is really a rallying point for belonging. One of the other big elements that we have found in community is trust, is that unless you have established trust, the community is not going to be effective. So you have to spend a lot of time building trust. Think about that for a minute. How might you do that in a community? What does trust look like in your workplace or in your cross conversations? Anybody? Yeah. So there's this regularity. The trust is built over time because you're consistent. They know that when I'm sorry, your name is? Brian. So I know when I contact Brian, this is the kind of reaction I'm going to get. So I trust that relationship has been built. What else does trust look like? How does?
I ask you to be patient, by the way, so you get a microphone.
Oh, right, because we have. Yeah, wait.
Actually, I have a
Sure.
question. But trust it's built more. It's not just interacting, but it's actually delivering on what's communicated, right? Because,
Right. So you do your promise, or you
well, people
you
always talk
stand
about
behind your promise.
walking your talk, right?
Right.
Because talk, you can say something, but if you find that it doesn't happen, then that doesn't build trust. Right.
Right. Right. So you have to make sure that you deliver on what you've said.
Right.
Okay. So consistency. What else builds trust?
Reciprocity that you can actually get from but also give to. Otherwise, it's a dependency or one way, and you don't feel valued.
Right. And the interesting thing about communities is a term that has been coined is called generalized reciprocity. So it's not necessarily a one-on-one. If I give this amount, I'm going to get that amount back. It's if I give this over time, I will get back even more. So this notion of reciprocity is really, really important in community. And one of the reasons why you keep coming back, that eyeball glue that we all look for with websites, same thing with community. What keeps bringing people back? What kind of value is created? What other ways could you see trust? You're a very diverse group, and yet you've got a centralized call to action. How will you establish trust amongst these many groups?
I don't know if this is what you were going for, but a common background, culture, or set of experiences
Right.
helps to establish trust.
Right. It's very difficult. As Etienne was talking about, bringing people who speak different languages. So what's that translation? How do we take what I'm thinking about and how I'm communicating and have that make sense to you? There's a wonderful researcher, thinker here in Toronto, Chun-Wei Chu, who's at the Faculty of Information Studies. He's written a fabulous book called The Knowing Organization, and he's put together a model that is about sense-making and how we try to find common ground in our language so that we can create that understanding making sense, which again goes a long way for trust.
Openness and honesty.
Right. That's an interesting one in communities, isn't it? Because a community will keep you honest. It will be very much, you can put something on the table and someone will come in and say, you're full of baloney. That isn't the way it works at all. The transparency within community is really built through that constant interchange and a constant challenge to ideas that are on the table. Open and honest is a challenge that we're having on the web, a great challenge, because of the way you can present yourself on the web. The notion of avatars, we were talking earlier this morning over breakfast about Second Life, and what kind of persona, what kind of avatar that you're going to present. How do we know that you're open and honest? I've never seen you before. So there's extra challenge to building community in a virtual world because you can present yourself in so many different ways. So you can see these are things that you need to talk about as a group. And if I sound disjointed, I'm trying to get into some of the things that are really important to community. So understanding what your shared purpose is as well as your individual purpose is extremely important. Secondly, establishing trust and ways that you're going to communicate the norms of the community are extremely important. But one of the things that we found with community is people come, as I said before, that purpose is they need to know. And so information and knowledge, and I'd like to make the distinction between the two because I'm an educator, and my belief is that knowledge comes from turning information into action, that you're able to take information and then do something with it. And as a librarian, I'm extremely interested in how people organize information and how they access it. And then as an educator, I'm more interested in how they use it. Librarians don't typically care how you use it as long as they bring you the book truck and it's 9,000 databases with 1 million citations in it. Then I think I've done my job. But what's really important about community is not just putting all this information on the table, is that you're able to internalize it and then do something with it. So back to the B. I've always loved this statement. It comes from a book that Carl Odell wrote about HP called If HP Only Knew What HP Knew. Is that notion, of it. Have you seen that Joe Hari window about know what you know what you don't know what you don't know, or don't know what you know and don't know what you don't know? It's a wonderful comic shtick, too, if you want to work through it with a puppet, which we did do at one of our institutes. But anyway, the thing is that we have so much information that we're drowning in it, but we really do share very little knowledge. And I think if you have children, or if you're a fan of Ice Age, this is what's happening in communities. This is what's happening with the web, is that we're drinking from that fire hose and we're not doing anything with it. And that, I think, within community, you really have the opportunity to then do something with this information. How we set this up at Clerica, and one of the handouts is a chapter that's actually a summary of the larger book that Hubert and I wrote back in 2000. When we were building communities, we were working very much on a lot of the thinking that Etienne and Bill Snyder and Richard McDermott had put together in cultivating communities, which, again, looked very much at the grassroots and informal nature of communities. And Hubert Saint-Onge, who was our VP of Strategic Capabilities, felt that if you put some infrastructure in place, if you give communities some time, attention, and resources, you can leverage them. And that's where we were coming from. We were putting some infrastructure in place in order to support communities which already existed. We knew that there were communities, but we said if we aligned communities with some of our strategic imperatives, perhaps we could leverage this knowledge exchange instead of it just being this fire hose where we were feeding out information to the agents. So we took on the agent, I don't know if you know how Clerica is organized, but all of the agents are businesses of one. They are not employed by Clerica. They were independent agents. They were not employees. And so you had kind of this merry band of gentlemen, and mostly they were gentlemen, but who were coming together for their own purpose, which was to create a business based on what Clerica had to sell. And we were told these people are extremely competitive. There's no way they're going to talk to each other. And we found that they were one of the most chatty bunch of coconuts we'd ever run into. So I think you could look at your people within the community and say this isn't going to work. If you set yourself up for failure, it will. But anyway, what we looked at was what kind of architecture should we have in place. Hubert had tried on 2 other occasions. He neglected to tell me this when I accepted the job of organizing communities. They had had 2 fantastic failures, and I was the 3rd attempt at this to get the agent network up and running. And because I'm a very process-oriented person, came into it thinking a little differently about how we might put this structure in place, and followed a very project plan kind of orientation. And what the book is really stepping you through how we did this, because people hadn't done this before in kind of a systematic way. But this knowledge architecture, which was something that Clerica, the knowledge team, had already put in place, is something that we utilized in the community. And I think it really speaks volumes about how we take knowledge or information that has been codified and placed in a repository, in the databases, whatever, and bringing it out, constantly cycling through the community. I think Etienne has said that knowledge lives in the community. That's one of your more famous taglines, I think. So you can't leave the knowledge sitting in repositories. You have to bring it out and validate it, enliven it, freshen it, and then you can put it back for access later. There's a really interesting study going on in the UK about best practice. It's saying, we talk a lot about best practice as, why don't we just learn from what we do and not make those mistakes over and over again? And yet we constantly do, because the situation has changed, the techniques have changed, people implement things in different ways. It's almost impossible to replicate best practice in my experience because of the dynamics of the world that we live in. At any rate, doesn't mean we shouldn't look back and try not to repeat problems. But the thing is, you've got to keep this in context of what's going on in the moment, at that time, etc., with those people. So we built our knowledge infrastructure was based on two elements: knowledge access and knowledge exchange. Think about this not just as codified knowledge, but how do we access people? That was what was far more important to us. It wasn't the databases. We were a Lotus shop at that point. And it wasn't the gazillions of databases that were available through our notes application. It was, how do I find the right people? Because they're the ones I want to talk to. I don't want to read about it in a document. So what we've found in providing self-service information is that you can make it really easy to get at and provide a lot of tier 0 service. But really, think about when you're on the line going through the menu on the telephone. How many of you just hit 0 right away because you want to talk to somebody, right? You know, that's what we want. So how do we provide access to knowledge through the databases that are there available to the organization as well as the people? And when the federal government, you may remember a number of years ago, Chrétien had put a challenge to all the federal departments to go online. And Canada, John Manley was the Minister of Industry at that time and was probably one of the only senior cabinet members who could work PowerPoint. Now you probably wish nobody had gotten to that level where we could all work PowerPoint. But anyway, the thing was we were trying to make information accessible when it really was we want to have access to people. And some of the most, I was at the Faculty of Information Studies here at the U of T at the time, and a lot of the work we did on the Government Online project was to put profiles up of people so that we could get access to people. So anyway, there's this constant cycling of information and knowledge through the group, some that you want kept persistent, but not everything. We think we need to record everything that's been known. If you've spent any time in records management, has anybody here done some trying to organize your electronic files on your desktop to provide access to for the rest of the world to see? Not something you really want to do. And yet we have some government mandates, depending on the area we're working in, to keep that electronic record. At any rate, this notion of taking things from a repository, whether that is a database kind of repository or a person, we then take it and move it into what's called our perceptual field and make sense of it. And then we can put it back and leave it there for the next person to take out and interact with it. So when you're setting up your community, and I think when Dominic and Shirley were talking to me earlier about this, they said the government had offered the group to put some technology into place, and yet it was really thinking through how are we going to engage with people and engage with what they know that was more important to the group than building some big databases. On the other hand, when you come back to community, the knowledge of the community is what the draw is. At the Harvard Business School, we have a huge executive education business. And what we find over time is while our executive education participants want access to the library and its many holdings, they want access to the faculty and their thinking. The bottom line is they want access to the people who are in their class. They want to talk to these people, and they want to continue that relationship. So anything you can do that would engage people in this conversation, I think you'd go a lot further in meeting your mandate. One of the challenges I have at Harvard is how do we capture, I was talking to Olaf a little bit about this, is how do we capture all of the thinking that goes behind the creation in a research project. So how do we capture everything that happens around the creation of knowledge? typically in scholarly publishing or any kind of publishing is we look at the end product, which is the book or the paper or the presentation. And in fact, people are almost more interested in how did they get to that spot as opposed to what was at the end. So our challenge has, our dean has challenged us to put a knowledge web in place that will capture these thought processes, the discoveries, the conversations as the research program is rolling out. Fascinating. So the first thing we did is we started working, I have a really interesting professor working in the marketing area by the name of Kash Rangan. And Kash has worked very hard in looking at what is the role of commercial enterprise in solving many of the problems of poverty. And so there's this whole area that's looking at working, not even with emerging markets, but submerged markets. People who have less than $1 a week to spend. How can you make how can business contribute to moving people out of poverty? And so he teaches this course called Serving Markets at the Base of the Pyramid. And what we said was that this is a new thought. I mean, we've had NGOs, we've had governments, we've had lots of people throwing money at the poverty question, but we're not getting out of poverty. What could business bring to bear? What has business learned that can help reach this marketplace? And so there's about 5-6 people who are working in this various area. How do we bring this collective intelligence together? How do we build a knowledge base that we can move forward on? And so what we did in the library is we brought a whole variety of resources together and built them a site that's a conversation, a knowledge exchange area. And we seeded it with a whole bunch of information that wasn't a fire hose type, but that had gone through a fair bit of vetting by subject matter experts and kind of did that distillation to say, here are some of the top, this is what's being thought about. It isn't the fire hose. What it is, it's working through some filters because you only have so much time and you only have so much attention. So what value can we bring to this? So this is, again, something you might do to this for this community, is not necessarily bring all the information together in one spot, but to move that through a filter and bring the salient things to the table. So let's think about that for a minute. What kind of information sources or who are the kinds of knowledge bases, the human knowledge bases, that you might want to access? Somebody think about that. What would you really like to know in this community, looking at solving this problem of commercialization? What would you really like to know? Anybody have an idea?
I'll give you an example of what I'm often asked from the National Angel Organization is, who are the angels that should be investing in this company, this early stage company?
So you just need to know what are the possibilities out there, who could come to the table. So having some sort of profiling of the angel investors available to support this work, is that?
They tend to like to stay fairly quiet.
It is
at least knowing
where to go to find them. Okay. So that would be something of value that this community might be looking for. What else what kind of information might they want to have?
Well, there are a variety of examples along the value chain. I mean, they form, the kinds of things that can be protected as intellectual property, the forms of protection that might be available, and not speaking abstractly, but being fairly concrete. The kinds of agreements that might be potentially put in place to exploit that IP, and what do those agreements look like? And a lot of people want to know, what are the appropriate licensing rates and dollar figures and real information that people can start building some concept of. How big does a market have to be to make it worthwhile going down a path? I mean, there are, I don't know, you can just imagine every question along the chain from an idea to a market.
So they're really looking for the manual, right? How do I bring best practice? Okay, what else? So what might that look like? Would that be stories of success stories, elements of
I'd say stories plus facts and figures. Plus,
Stories.
Why different numbers are different. What's different about things that ought to look the same, but in fact they are very different.
Okay. Okay. Yep.
I'd say what we get quite often, in addition to those, is competitive technology intelligence. In other
Okay.
words, who's doing what to whom? Where's that technology? Is it going to compete with me? Where? And of course, then critical market intelligence. Those are the key elements that then the entrepreneur and the board of directors of these young companies and the tech transfer offices use to try to differentiate their value proposition. And so those, and then of course success stories.
Right.
Who's done it and how and what was their insight. So what they're looking for is really insight.
Insight. Okay.
But they're looking for specifics within that context, the tools of the trade.
Okay. Anything else that you can think of that the community would be looking for from an information base?
We've got one over here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, as you already pointed out, that really resonated well with me is they really want to know about the process as opposed to thinking. You can find. I mean, I've collected over my last 20 years, all the time. Anytime I see a royalty rate, a royalty figure, a number, so I know I've seen every number from 2 to 15 or 20, but because there's no process to any of these, they're all just numbers, and they actually have no application the next day when someone says, I only want to give you one, and I could say, well, I want to give you, I think it's 3. And they say, why? And I say, well, I've got a huge list of numbers that go all the way from 1 to 15. But without the process of the last guy sort of saying, the reason it was 3 in this case was this, this, and this, it's still just another number. And there's very expensive books. They're $2,000 a piece that have all the numbers and lists, but they're still just lists. And if I can talk to someone like Terry and say, why did you get to, what was the argument, what was the process? And that's the stuff, as you mentioned, it's never published. The results are published, but the process or the thinking, and that's why I think you have to talk to humans, is they will kind of shed some light onto that. We went kind of here, we went kind of there, and this is how we got to 2. And then when I talk to the next guy, I can argue and say, the reason I think we should be there is, the same kind of story. I'll use, and see what we can get away with.
Right. One more. Yep.
I think that one of the more interesting questions we get here are unfortunately those ones that you can't really articulate, the questioner can't, to back to your issue about knowing what you don't know, having the person come in who presents what they're trying to do, and then you can see, well, have you addressed this issue? And they didn't even know it was an issue. So unfortunately, I think a lot of the information that is valuable to someone, they don't know to ask it.
Right.
So doing this sort of self-identification, data mining is great, but you have to know what you're looking for in order to find it.
Right.
And so that's the problem, I think. And what sort of the human component is being able to look at someone's idea and say, well, have you thought about this? And they might not have otherwise looked for it.
Right, right. I think what I'm trying to get at in this, in your contributions, is that many communities have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building these huge repositories of information just in case somebody wants to get at it. That's called a library. What we have found for communities is they need to build the knowledge base as they're going, because that knowledge and the information is in situ. It's how you first came up with the notion of communities of practice, wasn't it? Is that you were looking at learning in situ. So you build it as it's needed, not just in case. So community knowledge is very specific to the moment, as opposed to just in case somebody might need to know that. So what we've found with communities where you've got a large need for an information exchange is that very often a role that is probably one of the more valuable contributors to the community is the information broker. Someone who can say, it's in that $2,000 book, but it's Tim who really knows how to apply that and bring those two things together, as opposed to setting up a library with a whole bunch of material in it that may be accessed at some point. So the content is really important, and I would challenge you to think about that as you go forward, of what kind of information and what kind of access to people will bring the most value to the community. I wanted to also just spend a little bit about time talking about collaboration, because this is more the space that I've been working in lately, is how do we bring this collective intelligence together to bear on a problem? And the Human Genome Project is probably one that I think that it would resonate with many of you, is that they had to adjust the project plan because the work being done was a year ahead of schedule. Now, isn't that like music to anybody's ears? That the collective intelligence moved that project along at a speed no single individual could have ever hoped to accomplish. So how do we try to solve this problem faster? That's really what a community comes together for. Think about the tsunami. If all of these people had not come to help those people move forward, the progress would not be where it is today. Look at what's happened with Katrina. Have they seen as much benefit from community there as we've seen from the victims of the tsunami? Be interesting to study the two differences, why there's been progress in one area and not another around a natural disaster like that. At any rate, collaboration, I think these points are things that you need to think about, is how do you encourage dialogue as opposed to debate? As academics, and I can say that with all due respect, tend not to dialogue, they tend to debate. And I don't think that you've got a lot of room for that in your community. Trust, as I talked about before, as being key common goals. You may have different perspectives that you bring to the table, and that's fine. But as long as you can find that Venn diagram, that intersecting point, you're not going to have everybody on the same page. That's ridiculous to think. It's going to bring you together in common purpose, but you're still going to bring lots of different perspectives to the table, and you need to honor that. And that's what happens with dialogue in my experience. Empathy is another key to community that we're just learning more and more about. Empathy is the ability to understand something from another person's perspective. It's not that I have to be an alcoholic in order to treat an alcoholic or work with an alcoholic, but I have to understand where they're coming from. I have to have empathy for that particular situation. And I think when we're bringing a bunch of groups together, you have a different kind of community that you're trying to form, one that goes across organizations and across central purposes or individual purposes that you're bringing to the table. So I think you, more than anybody else, need to develop a sense of empathy of where people are coming from. And what you were talking about, openness and honesty, how are you going to establish that? Again, extremely critical to this kind of community. And the last thing, the collaboration skills, was a huge piece of why Hubert Saint-Onge at Clerica felt community was so important, was that we had to build this capability of collaboration within the organization, because he saw how the insurance business could not stand on its own. It had to rely on a lot of different industries. And his point was that I can't collaborate externally if I don't collaborate internally. So how will I help engender? How will we help build these skills of collaboration in order to collaborate with the organizations externally? Another thing that we found really interesting is, because this was a point in time in the year 2000, that the agents were all, the laptop was their office. They were very, very laptop savvy, computer savvy, and yet they knew nothing about the web. And so what we decided to do was to use a community tool that was web-based so that we could introduce the concept of the web. The bigger picture thing for Clerica was moving into e-commerce. It was not something that had been done with insurance before. So we're not going to set up a whole bunch of workshops on the web, because people, unless they could bring it into their practice, They weren't going to learn it in the same way. So we wanted to pull these kinds of things into community and use it as a learning group, an opportunity to build different kinds of capabilities than what, again, within the context of the situation. So think about some of these collaborative capabilities that you might need to engender in your group. Do you have any competition amongst possible community members? Oh, no, none, says Mark. So, yeah. So how are we going to engender this notion of coopetition as opposed to competition? Some things to think about, at any rate. This is a really interesting site that I love doing a new talk because it forces me to go back out on the web and see what's going on here. And I run into all kinds of things that I hadn't seen before. And I thought you might look at some of the models that are out there for people who get together to try to make sense of things. And this is a group that has, like a Wikipedia, a group of educators who have come together to try to educate us about education. And it's called InFed. Have a look at it, just an interesting site. This new collaboration, I think, is a fantastic idea because it's walking the talk. And they've adopted the slogan, "We are smarter than me." Have you seen this? It's basically building a book about business collaboration collaboratively. It's jointly sponsored by MIT and Wharton. And we can learn a lot from them. In fact, I'm missing today, the CEO of this group is at Harvard talking about this whole project today. And this might be something that you'd want to bring to the group, is how do we collaborate amongst competitors? How do we collaborate, build these collaboration skills by actually doing a collaboration instead of just talking about it or learning about it in isolation. So have a look. It'd be interesting to see how this comes out. And I like to put this slide up because oftentimes we forget in building knowledge bases, websites, whatever, is that this is what people really come to community for. They come to talk to people. So how do we do that in a way, how do we provide those opportunities to talk? And the third piece, if I've walked through this whole presentation in the way I had planned it, is to talk about a problem in design where you look at context, content, and form. What kind of form are you going to take? So I mentioned earlier the whole community experience at Clerica became a dual-track thing for us, not only to build this community for the agent network, but to also to look at that process of community building. So we became, are you familiar with Donald Schoen's work, the reflective practitioner? That notion of thinking about what we're doing as we're doing it, like, isn't that novel? Why don't we do that more often? Instead of the notion of an after-action review, why don't we do a continuous think about what we're doing? And so when we were putting this community model together, we were also charged to be building a model. So the first community that we put up, the Agent Network, we spent about 6 months. We spent a lot of time planning. And we were planning for success as opposed to the possibility of failure. And we didn't leave much unturned. We really wanted this to be a success after having 2 flaming failures, as Hubert is happy to call them. So we'd identified this process for building the infrastructure to support a community. We didn't build community. The communities built themselves. We provided them with that infrastructure, and maybe that's something that you will do as a group, is to provide the infrastructure, not just the technology, but the whole environment for the community. And what we found was the first one took us about 6 months. We spent a lot of time at it. We documented it. That's, as I said, that's what the book really is, as our whole project plan. We just put it out there for anyone to use. And then we were to a point prior to the merger with Sun Life where a community would come to us to have access to the infrastructure, and we could get up, it would be up and running within about 3 weeks. So the organization was very interested in that we were able to take a process that was, from 6 months down to 3 weeks and get it up and out the door. And this is just the model that we followed. Now, a process model is only, it's there as a guide. This isn't a recipe. So I really caution you that you have to think about how would this work in a different environment. But we did spend time, a fair bit of time, talking about what it is we wanted to accomplish. And it was that dialogue that I think helped us set up for success, because we knew what we were doing. We knew there was a common space, a common understanding about shared purpose, etc. Then we went about establishing all of the community components. We looked at quite a number of our agents actually took Etienne's online course about communities, so they understood what the structure was and what was expected. And the core group, and another one of Etienne's slides shows that core group of people really understood what community was, so that you add those other layers. And we didn't call them lurkers, the ones on the edge. We called them absorbers, because lurkers sort of had a different connotation than we wanted the agents to have. But at any rate, we had this central group of people who really drove the community's success, because they understood what we were trying to do with the community. So we had all of those components in place. We had governance. We had a whole issue right at the very end that we ran up against, didn't even think about, was privacy and compliance. And why didn't we think of that right off the bat? But the organization was very concerned that if conversation in these communities was then accepted as practice, was Clerica liable for that practice, especially if it was contra to regulation or whatever. So, there's all kinds of things you need to think about, especially if you're going to be rubbing up against some of these issues, and I would imagine in this kind of community you would be. And then we launched it and had a very purposeful, very celebratory launch. What we found then is in the second phase, this is really where the community took off. And the first part was really the most boring part. That was, that's the grunt work. That's the logistics of getting things up and running. And then this cycling in through the second phase was really far more interesting and a lot more fun. Because this is where you saw ideas germinating and taking off, and people being able to come back to the community and say, you made a difference to a sale. And that's really what we wanted to hear. I walked this client down to the bank and we signed over the check. That was success for that particular problem that was discussed in the community. So the community became very celebratory around the various successes that we were able to realize due to this kind of knowledge exchange. And your community may look very different than this. This is just one example of what we saw happening. We used a tool. It was kind of interesting with the agent network. Again, they were, as I said, they were very computer savvy. They knew their laptop. We had very few forms at Clerica. Everything was pretty paperless, but they didn't know how the web worked. And so this was a first web interface, and it's a little old now, but this we partnered with an organization called Communispace. And they built this whole infrastructure for dialogue for us. And it had a lot of different components. There was a library in here, a knowledge center. There was an opportunity this is a pre-space, or comes before MySpace, because we had a photo gallery in here. And what we found was really interesting is the agents, because they were all individual contributors and business owners, they wanted to know, like, what does your office look like? How have you set up an office? And so we were able to post pictures. They could see what kind of ergonomics, what kind of chairs people had, and what kind of fax machines they'd set up. We were able to share newsletters that people produced, etc. So it was really driven by the work that the various agents did. The biggest challenge within this was to take this 2D space and make it 3D. So the addition of the pictures, you can see this is That was me quite a number of years ago. But we always had a picture attached to everything so that people could see who they were talking, quote unquote, see who they were talking to. We did a lot of video conferences, but in fact, this community never ever met face to face. It was totally virtual. Even our working group never met face to face, like 100%. So we had this extra challenge of how do you build trust online when you don't have the opportunity to build it face-to-face first. And there are lots of different models about bringing people together and then having them go work online, bringing them back, so that you get that kind of face-to-face off and on. But there are, successes with purely virtual, too. So some of the things I'd like you to think about, and we'll have a few minutes to talk about it, is that from my perspective, this is my 2 cents worth, things that you might want to consider as you're planning, is that you have to be clear about what the value proposition is for everyone, because they're coming to community for something. So you need to know what is it they're going to get out of it. And you've got to be very clear about that. That's part of the open and honest. I'm coming here because I need to know how to make a successful business, or I need to know who's been successful before so I can pick their brain. But it's really understanding what are all of those things that are coming together in community. We've also found that communities that you resource are far more, they're effective faster. We liken this to somebody who goes and seeks counseling. We're all fairly relatively intelligent human beings, and we might get to that point eventually. But through some counseling or facilitation, you're going to get there faster. And so that's what we found with communities, too, is if we had dedicated facilitation, somebody who saw a question coming into the community and said, oh, right, Dominic will know about that. So Dominic, I know he's traveling and he's not going to be able to access the community, but if I fire a message off to him and say, gee, Dom, would you go in and have a look in the community? So facilitating that kind of knowledge exchange was extremely valuable in us being faster to resolution. The content, as I said before, is that you can seed it, but don't build it in isolation. Let that knowledge base be built over time as people need specific information. You don't need to provide them with a fire hose. One of the things that actually ended up being the demise of the ancient network, that's a little Freudian slip, the agent network, is that in the end, Sun Life thought it owned the community, and in fact it didn't. It owned the infrastructure that supported the community, but the community owned itself. It was a community from the true sense of the word, that it was self-managed and it was self-governed. And when the organization tried to take ownership of it, it went underground. And instead of having a link and a dialogue into that community, they now no longer have any access to that community. So by trying to own it, they actually killed it. Something to think about. So, another thing to think about is that one size isn't going to fit all. You may have to try a whole bunch of different approaches. We were 3 times lucky, or on the 3rd chance we were lucky. So you may have to try different things. And this is where an organization in particular really loses patience with failure. And rather than looking at it as what can I learn from that and move forward, shut it down. So be open to failure. I think you'll learn more from your failures than you might want to think about. Nobody wants to fail. So we think about it as learning. We also felt that piloting made a big difference. We tried a whole bunch of pilots. We did the Jackson Pollock School of Art. We just threw a whole bunch of stuff at the wall and saw what stuck. And that you may, if you have the appetite for that, you may find that useful. Technology is an enabler, not a driver. It's the people who drive it. It's not the system. If you invest a lot in a technology before you invest in the community itself, I think you're going to run into some problems. And you're just starting out. This really is the tip of an iceberg. I think you will find what you create is going to delve into those depths and to be able to surface a lot more. So there's a lot of experience with communities. There's I put together in your packet some lessons learned. The art group in the UK did a really interesting study of, I think there's 16 or 17 communities. And what I did is each one of their case studies, they listed all the lessons learned. And so what I did is I took all of those lessons and did a bit of a synthesis for you and organized it again by a framework that Chun Wei developed here at the University of Toronto that looks at the vision and strategy, the roles and responsibilities, the process and procedures, the content, and the infrastructure. And maybe you can take in your conversations, have a look at some of those things and say, how can I take those lessons and apply them here? I've also put together a short resource list for you. There are a couple of websites around communities that are just mammoth, and you will be down in this iceberg for a very long time. You'll never surface on some of those sites. Etienne's group, the CP Square, is a fabulous group of online discussion around communities, and you might want to tap into something like that and talking with practitioners who have had the experience of developing different communities in different situations. And then just some things that you might want to think about in your discussions about how do we identify core purpose, how do we establish trust, what kinds of information might we have in place. But I think once you head down the path, you'll get a lot of positives from this work. And it may not be exactly the thing that you thought you were building, but my guess is you will get the return will be not just at that organizational level, but at an individual level that you just couldn't have foreseen. So I'll be happy to take any questions about some of the communities I've worked with over the course of time. I think we've got... First we're going to applaud you. We're going to applaud you. Okay.
You talk about collaboration skills. What would those be? Just sort of an itemized
Probably
list
top at the list of collaboration skill or capability we talk about is active listening. Key to collaboration is the ability to listen. We don't spend a lot of time listening to one another. The notion of being able to varying perspectives, valuing what someone puts at the table and not just discounting it, but valuing it and moving on from there. There's a lot of, when we look at a collaborative process, we often see people who want to dominate, and that really isn't part of a collaboration. Listening, learning, lots of skills. So that, you know, there are things that you probably do, but you don't call out as a distinctive capability or as something you want to pay attention to.
Comment here.
Oh, yeah.
Pardon my snicker about privacy and security. It's just we put up with so much these days.
Yeah, I know. It's tough.
I think with a community practice, it's extremely difficult because, in effect, the community defines its own privacy and security to a large extent.
Right.
And so it's almost a dynamic thing. Obviously, there's certain laws you have to obey, but...
Yeah. What we found, again, with the agent network, it was a closed community. It wasn't just something up on the web. And part of that was to keep some of that discussion within the community so that it wasn't misinterpreted, that it wasn't taken and applied in ways that weren't agreed to by the community. And when Etienne writes, I think it's a whole chapter on the dark side of communities and how having this kind of enclosed culture also can lead to elitism and exclusionary as opposed to inclusive and building. So, you know, you've got a lot of tensions in community. People think that this is a silver bullet, and it really isn't. You have to work very hard at making it work.
No,
I want to put
not only not silver bullet, but sometimes it can backfire. But speaking about the community at Clarica,
Yeah.
something that should be said is that Hubert was the VP of Strategic Capability who sponsored that community and had to make the commitment not to go look.
We didn't give him a password, and boy, did that make him crazy. He wanted to be in that community, and I was the facilitator, so he called me the lioness because I protected that community from any Clerica management having access to it. And the only way that they had access to it was when we invited them in for a conversation, and they were at the table anytime we wanted them in.
That's an interesting aspect of privacy. Here is a community that's in a somewhat politically charged environment. You know, I mean, you have a company, people who have their little business selling product, and company, not always perfect love between the two and all. And so for Hubert to sponsor that community meant a commitment that he only had access to those part of the communities that were explicitly designed by the community to be in that relationship. So to me, that was an example.
Talk about trust. And that's where the trust broke down, Hubert was constantly protecting that community and trying to create trust with the rest of the senior executives that this was not, the agent network was not going to be a bitching post. That was really what it came down to, is they didn't want to place a forum for the agents to carp about the policies of the organization. And because the members policed themselves, quote unquote, they kept that, if the conversation went off rails, they brought it back to where it needed to be. So the organization had to trust that the community members would keep that going. And we had some problems, there's no question. We had one time when the agents were very angry about a change in commission rate. And so one of the members of the community organized a whole email campaign that at that time brought down the email system at Clerica because they flooded the senior executives' boxes with these things, and it was all organized through the agent network. So then we lost a great deal of trust and had to work back. That community was very close to being shut down, and again, Hubert went to bat and said, okay, what can we learn from this instance, as opposed to, let's not just shut it down. What can we learn and move forward? So this notion of, let's learn from what happened, as opposed to just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But trust was not only within the community, but it was from the senior management that they should fund this infrastructure. It was fascinating.
About the role of the sponsor, that he would defend that community to which he wasn't even given access. You know, it's just like really emotionally interesting.
I just want to, it's sort of like having a child and then having to let them go and not interfering. I just want to put these two guys on the spot because you've been working in collaboration for a while now, and get your comments and some of the things that you're doing, if I could, with you, Duena.
So from my point of view, having tried to build communities, sometimes we impose the community on people who didn't want to be part of a community. So we as researchers came up with a question which we thought was valid, pertinent, and something that was hot. And we kind of built the community, and then we invited people to participate.
Right.
We targeted groups that we thought that might have a, interest in participating. However, it didn't work out very well. So again, the community has to come from a group of people who have something in common and would like to participate. So they have to own it.
Yep.
Whereas it was us pushing something to them. It was, very difficult as researchers to figure out. We do want to research the virtual collaboration in itself. Then how do you do it? Do you start with a group that is already been built and then you introduce yourself and try to study it that way? Or do you build a community on your own and then you evaluate it that way? So that's one of the lessons learned, right? I mean, we had also success stories, but I think it's more important to learn from what didn't work,
right? Instead
of the success. Yes, it's easy, but.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all because we have a platform that has been built with funds from Ontario. It's called the Platform for Public Engagement. We are very interested in e-democracy and how to give the public a role in the decision-making process that should be shaping most of our discussions. And we are double-dipping by using that platform to support communities of practice. So we have $1.5 million worth of infrastructure thanks to what was called the Ontario Innovation Trust which is not called that anymore. I know. And by the Canada Foundation for Innovation. And I would just like to offer it to this group as a resource to be used, so we avoid duplication of effort. We can do things that probably no other organization can do, perhaps in Canada or the world. And one of our challenges is how to get a community like this to volunteer and participate in efforts that would help us understand how these electronic tools could help us achieve a goal. So I would like just to issue an invitation to the group. And Doina, that's what Dominic mentioned, is quite happy to provide some information on this platform to anybody who might be interested.
So hopefully I can demo some of the tools tomorrow, but if people are interested ahead of time, they can come and talk to me. I'll be happy to share.
And everybody, all the participant contact information is behind tab 5.
Yeah. So I basically have an invitation for the group to
Sure.
consider becoming members of a collaborative community and try to figure out together what are the challenges that we may face.
Truthfully, if you don't have to worry about infrastructure, if there's a platform that you can use, you take a big piece off the table. But again, if it's going to meet, you have to analyze it to see if it's going to meet your needs.